All right. Well, here comes part four of being religious, not spiritual. Now, we've talked about what Gnosticism is. We've talked about how it is the great metaphysical foundation of modernism. It is the cement that all of well, it's Jello, really. It's the Jello that all of the different modern attempts at saving the world, attempts at putting things right. Every modern conception is founded on some sort of Jello foundation of Gnosticism. And But we've talked about how Gnosticism it teaches that we need to be saved from matter, from our flesh, from our bodies. We need to be saved from history. We need to be rescued from this situation within time to some sort of timelessness, and that we need to be saved from institutions, or that institutions are automatically suspect because of Gnosticism, and that the salvation comes by means of our mind, getting the right ideas about things into our head, getting the secret knowledge, coming to a real understanding of things, and that there is that Christianity, on the other hand, is a historic religion, right? That it is a religion where God acts within history, and that we are saved back into history. When we looked at how God uh, sent Christ into flesh to be born of the Virgin Mary, um, and in order to be saved, we actually needed God to take on flesh, right? That is a good thing that God took on flesh. And then we see that we're saved because Jesus took on flesh. We're actually saved back into our flesh, into the proper use, the right use of our flesh. And that at the end of time, our flesh is going to be resurrected, that our flesh it's not eternal because it hasn't existed forever, but it will go on into the future. As far as we're told, it will go on forever. So it's not eternal in that it's always existed, but it is taking on eternality, and that's actually a really centrally important thing within Christianity. When you start talking about salvation, you start talking about flesh, you start talking about death and resurrection, you start talking about the resurrection at the end of time, that the just and the unjust will all be raised from the dead and then stand before the throne of judgment, and then those that don't serve Christ will go into hell. Those that did trust in Christ will spend eternity in their flesh with God, right? In perfect fellowship with God. And all of this is within the Apostles' Creed, within the Nicene Creed, within the definition of Chalcedon. Right away, when you start getting descriptions of what it is that Christians believe over against the people around them, we see the Apostles' Creed is a historically situated message. Right? It's a historically situated message. God sent his son at a particular time, in a particular place, at a particular moment within history. And when we say the Apostles' Creed together, we are declaring that we believe salvation happened in a certain place at a certain time, that God acted within history, that he acted uh, in the rule and reign of Pontius Pilate. Right. So if I said, "Oh yeah, I believe Jesus died and rose again," I said, "Oh, that's amazing." And you say, "Yeah, it was under Queen Elizabeth." Say, "Oh yeah, we're talking about a different Jesus. We're not talking about the same act of God." Right? Jesus died and resurrected, died and was raised by the Holy Spirit on the third day, uh, in under Pontius Pilate. It's a certain place, it's a certain time, and Pontius Pilate was one of the representatives that Psalm 2 tells us would gather together from all of the kings of the earth, would gather together, and they would crucify the Messiah. And Pontius Pilate was the imperial representative. Now we also get Herod, who was the representative of the Herod was the representative of the throne of David. You had Pontius Pilate was the representative of the imperial throne, which was established by God under Cyrus. Right? You have the uh, priestly line; the high priest is there. Then you have Abraham's seed also. You adding their there crucify him, right? So you have every single authority that God had established all show up, and each of them says, "Yes, crucify him," and they each, are like Psalm 2 says, gathering together to try and throw off the chains of God, or what they see as the chains of God. Right now, it's a little bit like a kite trying to free itself from its string by cutting the string, because it just falls, right? But that's in their mind what they saw. So the devil gathered together all of the authorities that he could, and Psalm 2 predicted this, and they tried to bring him down at a particular time, at a particular place. Now, Jesus, we're told, could have brought in all of the he could have brought in legions of angels to defend himself, so he was also voluntarily going to the cross. um, but it doesn't take away the fact that the ones that crucified him, you have the Jews, and you have Herod, and you have Pontius Pilate, and you have the temple system, that they all gathered together to try and crucify the Lord of glory. But Jesus, or we're told by Paul that Jesus came at the fullness of times. That means that God had spent time, he had spent history perfectly filling that moment for Jesus to arrive, right? That he had actually spent historical effort organizing time such that when Jesus arrived, it was the perfect moment. God had spent thousands of years preparing that place, preparing the language and the imagination of a people to be able to receive the Messiah. And he called Abraham from Ur. He gave him the covenant. He gave him circumcision. He gave him uh, Isaac and Jacob, and he gave them the tribal system. Right? He gave them all of the different princes of the tribes. He gave them the temple system. He gave them the sacrificial system. Right? It took a lot of sacrifices to develop a language, to develop the vocabulary that you would need to describe what Jesus was accomplishing on the cross. Right? He couldn't just say, "Well, Jesus was then sacrificed on the cross." Right? God actually spent time working within a people to develop sacrifices and a priesthood and all of the different rituals, to give them and their imagination a language to be able to receive and understand what the Messiah would do, right? So when Paul says he spent time studying the Bible and seeing that Jesus was on every page. He looked at the prophets. He looked at the establishment of the synagogue system in Ezra. He looked at them giving Cyrus and calling him the King of Kings. Right? All of those different things. All the law, the prophets, all of the Psalms, all of the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, all these different books were there because that's how much you need language wise to be able to describe the cosmic revolution that Jesus accomplished, right? That from the bottom to the top, the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, him sacrificing himself as both priest and as sacrifice, him being buried in the tomb, him being raised from the dead by the power of the Spirit, him ascending to the right hand of God, all of that. It was such a cosmic revolution that you needed 4,000 years of history of God working with a people, of God giving them messages, to just give a summary statement of what the cross and resurrection and ascension accomplished. That's what it takes to describe how immense what Jesus did was. And that took time for God to develop. And that's what it means, that it was the fullness of time. God had filled up all of that time with what was necessary to understand what it was that his son was being sent to do. And then the Roman Empire gathering the means of execution for years, so that when Jesus was crucified, He would be crucified in a way that was a perfect representation, right? The Romans didn't invent crucifixion; they inherited it. I mean, they stole it by taking over the empires of the world. They had been studying death; they had been studying the means of death and controlling people, right? And they they receive the crucifixion, um, so that he would be crucified on a rock, like the rock that gave water in the wilderness, right? When they're out there and God says, I will be on the rock, Moses, you strike the rock and water will come from it. Well, Jesus is crucified on a rock. He's crucified on Skull Mountain, Golgotha, right? So that when Jesus lifts up his head, um, he can lift up the head, like it says in Psalm 110, right? He's on a head, he's on a skull. That his skull would be through that his cross would be through Skull Mountain, like a skull with a sword through it, right? So that his cross would be shaped the same way that God organized the layout of the camps in the book of Numbers, right? So you've got when you do the math and you see how God organizes the camp layout around the tabernacle, it's a cross. Right? So they are a traveling cross as they travel through the wilderness. And you look at every number in the book of Numbers, the numbers that you have for the total numbers that the tribes, every single one of those numbers is can match up to how long it takes for one of the planets to go around the sun, right? They're literally numbered like the stars. They're traveling through the wilderness as a cross, right? All of these things are there because God is filling up the times so that when Jesus is lifted up off the earth, right? When Jesus is lifted up off the earth and when the sun, the moon, and the stars hide their face at him and it goes black, that we know part of the way that we know what that means is we look at the book of Numbers, that we look at all of the numbers that he gave us, that we look at the organization, that we look at the promise to crush the skull of the dragon, or that we look at the promise that Jesus would, that we look at the God's promise to give water in the wilderness. And then even when he dies, we see him stabbed in the rib and we see the blood and the water come out. So that, and we know that that's where Eve came out of. We know that blood and water end up being the metaphorical substance of the new Eve, the church, or in baptism in the Lord's Supper, right? God took time in history to prepare the language and the imagination of a people to be able to receive the Messiah, so that then the people could turn around and spread throughout the rest of the world, conquering the world with the sword of the Spirit, like it says in Hebrews that the sword is sharper than any two-edged sword, like Joshua's sword going into the land. The sword divides soul and spirit as it goes throughout the whole world, and it could conquer the whole world and with the understanding of the language and the language necessary to describe everything that Jesus accomplished on the cross. Jesus acted in history. God acts in history. And because of that, we're going to see tomorrow when we look at how we're saved back into history. Because of that, then what we do when we live our lives in history actually has a meaning and is no longer meaningless. So the Gnostics want to tell us that we have to be saved out of history, that we have to fly away, right? I'll fly away out of history. That's what salvation is. But here we see that God acts in history, moves towards history, saves us in history, and then we are then saved back into history because of it.